Hey there, I'm making this video about the recent situation here in the U.S. and sort of an international incident with this Edward Snowden, this international person who leaked sensitive surveillance activity from the U.S. government, NSA, and different organizations who have been looking into our data. He had a moral dilemma about that. This is the story, and he leaked it to the New York Times on June 6th. That's when the story first appeared, and then he made his identity known on June the 9th, 2013. Very interesting timing of all this, because actually what happened is, using sidereal zodiac, which is what we use in Vedic Astrology, Jupiter just entered Gemini on June 1st. So Jupiter goes from Taurus into Gemini on June 1st, and then 5 days later, maybe one of the biggest security breaches in U.S. history happens when Jupiter goes into Gemini and actually sets up right along the plane of the galaxy. And of course, Gemini is the sign of information. It's the sign of information, and the term whistleblower would definitely be considered something related to Gemini. So this transit of Jupiter into Gemini shows this kind of activity that we might expect right now. And if you look in the chart of the United States, it also happens in the 7th house of the USA chart, based on what we consider to be a reasonably useful time for the chart of the US, which has a Sagittarius rising sign. So what we also need to look at is the chart of Edward Snowden, if we have his chart available, and we do. We have some good information about his birth time and his birth date. Very interesting is the case, to say the least. He was born June 21st, 1983, on the summer solstice at 4:42 a.m. in North Carolina. He was born on the day of the solstice. So he's born on the summer solstice in 1983. And then, 20 days before the solstice, or actually 14 days, pretty much exactly 2 weeks before the solstice of 2013, this is leaked. And when you look at his birth chart, it's remarkable, because when he was born, the rising sign was Taurus, 18 degrees Taurus, with Mercury at 16 degrees right on the ascendant. So he's got Mercury right on the ascendant in his birth chart, 16 degrees of Taurus, and his rising sign 18 degrees. When the story was leaked, there was Mars and the Sun were right on his ascendant, and the Moon was also in Taurus. But what's most interesting about his natal chart is he has a very close Mars-Rahu conjunction in Gemini. Of course, this would be in his 2nd house of speech and values, and establishing his own paradigm of value and values, and speaking the truth, and how what we speak is a reflection of our values, and all of that stuff. Big stuff around 2nd house is speech, self-esteem, self-respect, how those things are an expression of our values. And of course, he's got Mars, Rahu, and also the Sun in Gemini in the 2nd house. But in particular, that Mars, Rahu is exact. Mars was like 1 degree, and Rahu was 1 degree 28 seconds when he was born in Gemini. And Jupiter, on the day of the leak, was like 1 degree of Gemini also. So when the leak happened on June 6th, Jupiter was right on his natal Mars-Rahu conjunction in Gemini. So powerful, so specific, and in his 2nd house, which has to do with speech and erratic speech, unpredictable speech. Mars, Rahu in Gemini. Mercury does really well in Gemini. Venus does well in Gemini. Even Saturn does well in Gemini, because they're more about neutrality and weighing our options and considering the consequences of what we're doing. Mars, on the other hand, is not so good in Gemini. It's impulsive. And Rahu actually does well in Gemini, but Rahu first of all takes his sanction from the planets he joins as a Bhava Lord and as a Graha. So Rahu is more like Mars here, because it's very close to Mars. And Mars, for this Taurus person, is the 7th and 12th house ruler, so that Jupiter going over his Mars-Rahu conjunction in the second house led him to do this impulsive, willful communication that essentially, sentenced him to exile, which is 12th house stuff. Mars is 12th house ruler for Taurus, and Rahu is the Karaka of foreign countries. Both. Now, even further, when you look at his natal chart and also the charts of these events, when the story first leaked, and in fact, even right now, he is having what's called a Saturn return, which is talked about a lot in Western astrology. It's always important when a planet returns, but when the story first leaked, that especially Rahu was right on his natal moon. His natal moon is, when he was born, his moon was about 15 degrees of Libra, and Rahu is like 22 degrees, and Saturn is 11 degrees. So Saturn and Rahu were squeezing his natal moon when he was born, and he also has Saturn in Libra as well. So again, all of this, and it's in his 6th house. So he's got Saturn Rahu going through his 6th house right now and going over his natal Saturn-Moon conjunction. So it's very telling what's going on with him. I didn't run his dashas or anything like that. I just wanted to show the transits at this point. I may very well do the dashas as, also. But with the transits, it's very specific because that really shows through any system. But the other thing that's really interesting is this happened so close to the summer solstice of 2013. So, he was born on the solstice, and so his sun was right on the plane of the galaxy, and now we really saw this story explode over the weekend when we had the summer solstice here, and the full moon in Sagittarius lighting up that Sagittarius-Gemini axis. There was a lot of movement around that story this weekend because he was an exile in Hong Kong, and then he made an unannounced trip to Russia, which really strained international relations between the U.S. and Russia. Again, Gemini is the 7th house of the United States chart. The 7th house has to do with other countries in a country chart. So this has really turned him into like a foreign ally, or some, a person who has at least really disrupted foreign relations. We have enough on the plate with Russia and Syria, and the stress and tension with international relations right now. This really complicated matters a lot, and again, you can see it really being accelerated due to this solstice connection, because he was born on the solstice. He's a very solstice kind of guy, and again, for the last 20, 30 years, the solstice has been happening right when the sun goes through the plane of the galaxy. That's what's happening right now, which is a very transformative section of the sky. And of course, this is the Sagittarius-Gemini axis, where Gemini is very much about whistleblowing, like we said, and it's about getting the information out regardless of what we're told to believe. And again, that sort of belief is very much about Sagittarius. You could see where being indoctrinated into a certain culture of belief, like national security or the surveillance program, or now you're being trusted, and I'm sure they're told to believe that it's all for the better of the American people and not to leak and not to say anything. But Gemini is very different. Gemini is a sign where we look at those things ourselves and rebel against our teachings. Like I've been saying the whole time since Jupiter went into Gemini, I said this is a time for us to really scrutinize what we believe, what we're told to believe, and really try to understand it ourselves. And of course, that means communicating about it and possibly really rebelling against those sacred cows, which includes our spiritual path and teachers. But this is a good example of it as well, because there's a whole culture of belief that surrounds, national security and the sort of cult of government. I mean, Sagittarius is a Kshatriya sign, which is related to the government. It's the government caste. That's what Sagittarius is, and this full moon in Sagittarius with the sun in Gemini and all this stuff happening on the solstice point shows this kind of rebelling against the convention.